said, the whole point of this was to revamp the original LED fundamentals from 8 years ago, whenever we did it. And it's for people who really need to get up to speed, because as you guys know, there's a lot of people now that still don't understand what is CCT, what is CRI, what are some of these terms. Especially I've found landscape architects, and I'm guilty of this, I get way more technical when I present to engineers, and then when I present to landscape architects, I focus more on pretty pictures. So they hear these terms and nobody ever really explains to them what they mean. So I've found landscape architects really like this, and new agents really like this, but as everything is now going to controls, if you're not up to speed on some of the LED fundamentals, you're really going to be behind when we start talking about integrating adaptive lighting. So that's what this is about. This is not a deep dive into any one topic. This is just touching on a number of topics that have become relevant in the last 10 years or so. So, you guys have heard me say this before, light travels faster than sound, which is why some people appear very bright until you hear them speak. I love that. So, pros and cons of LED. Why is everybody talking about LED? Why has it fundamentally changed our industry? We all know that it's got a long life. We always hear about energy savings. Those are very, very true. If you're doing a good LED conversion from traditional lighting, you really should be cutting your energy by 50% easily. The life is exponentially longer, and that's not only the life of the light source, the LED, versus a lamp, but just the prolonged level of illumination versus the rapid drop-off. So we all know that it lasts a long, long time. It uses a lot less energy. But other important issues, that long life contributes to a reduced maintenance cost. Because LED generally is not going to pay for itself just through energy savings. If I'm not mistaken, I think Notre Dame generates their own energy. A lot of places use hydro energy. There's a lot of places where energy is fairly cheap. So energy savings is not going to pay for an LED upgrade. But taking your maintenance cycle from 6 months or whatever it happens to be with your technology to 15 years, that's a huge savings. So that's very, very important to focus on. The directionality aspect. We're no longer starting with the lamp that's blasting light all over the place and some kind of an optic to capture as much as you can and redirect it to the ground in some kind of an IES distribution. Now you've got the ability to put that light source in the roof and automatically direct it down. And you can direct it very specifically where you want it to be, whether it's an IES pattern or a certain direction, or it's on a building or a street. It's much more directional and controllable than any other light source we've ever had. So you can put the light where you need it, and you can more effectively keep it away from where you don't want it. You're starting with a much better light source. And then finally, the fact that it's dimmable. We're used to living in a world where the lights come on at a certain time and they go off at a certain time. Now you can have the lights come on at a certain level at a certain time, and then later on, especially when vehicular and pedestrian activity drop, you can lower the light level. And then later on, you can lower it again, then you can shut it off. Adaptive lighting, adapting that level of light based on the day of the week, the time of the night, vehicular, pedestrian conflict, all those sorts of things, has changed how we think about energy savings. Because again, we don't have to have full power now for 12 hours on and off. Or you don't have to have a parking lot where when they want to save money, they just shut off every other fixture. That's not good, because now you're just creating dark spots. With this kind of technology, you can keep all the lights on, and you just bring them down later on at night or early in the morning, when again there's less activity. So these are all reasons to benefit from LED. And one of the things, in fact, Tim made a great point of this in LA, the fact that with traditional light sources, the lumen output, the depreciation is pretty steep and it's pretty fast. So you have to over-design. If the IES says you want X foot candles on this surface, you really have to design to a higher level with non-LED lights, because the lamping is going to depreciate so fast. LED, you don't need to do that. If you want this level of light, you design to that level of light, because it's going to stay there or pretty close to it for a long, long time. So consequently, you don't have so many sites that are overlit from day one because they're planning for those lamps to depreciate so fast. So a lot of benefits. Speaking of directionality, this is a great example of that. This is an LED installation. It's a little hard to see here in the room with the lights on, but if you can see from that photo, y'all promise not to go to sleep. You can see from that photo, the light almost stops like a curtain right there, right at the base of the pole. It doesn't actually go to 0 foot candles, but you can see it dramatically stops right there at the base of the pole. And again, that's an example of the controllability and the directionality you can get with this kind of light source. The primary barrier to entry probably still is price. It's not going to be the same thing that people are used to paying for decades for a certain light. Now they see the LED version and it costs more than what they're used to. But it's not the same thing. We get something in mind that this fixture should cost this much, or this shoebox, or whatever it is. But like these two phones not being the same, you're not comparing apples to apples. They're completely different. You know, we got Blu-rays, and the cost was a lot higher than a VHS tape. It's because it's not a VHS tape. You're going to get the better quality video, you're going to get better quality sound, you're going to get blooper reels and alternate endings and everything that goes with it. So it's not the same thing. Same thing with LED because of all those advantages we talked about. These are great timeless principles that people should always remember when they are thinking about price. Well, why does that cost more? You know, there's reasons for it, but always remember this. You get what you pay for. That's just the law of the universe. Also remember, price is what you pay today, cost is what you spend over time. You've really got to look at that with LED because, as we said, a lot of the cost savings is the maintenance cycle, and that's a time-related event. It's not what you paid the day you wrote the check. Those are the savings you're going to realize. So you want to take the long view, and remember, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. If anybody remembers, Greg Brady had to learn that the hard way, for those of us who are old. Here's a great example of let the buyer beware. I love this example. I won't tell you who the company was, but I was going down an aisle at Home Depot years ago, and I saw this LED lamp, and they had listed the color temperature as 5,000 K, which actually this was the one I first saw. They listed it right there on the scale. Here's warm, here's cool, here's 5,000 K. And that's how that lamp was marketed. A couple of months later, I went down the same aisle and I saw the new version of essentially the same lamp. And actually, it's a couple lumens different. Technically, it's a little different lamp, but it's basically the same thing. But what caught my eye was this. These are both 5,000 K, but because this company learned that people were starting to learn what color temperature meant. They were watching the Today Show and different things, and they were learning about color temperature and these new LED things and what cool LEDs meant versus warm LEDs. And you know, you really probably want warmer LEDs. They changed the marketing on this, and they took the 5,000 that used to be on the right side of the spectrum toward cool, and they just moved the bar and they put it toward warm. So it's the same color temperature, but they're just telling you now, oh, no, this is a warm color. Because they're learning that people wanted warmer colors. So again, beware. You have to learn about these things so you know when people are trying to hoodwink you, they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. There's a lot of games being played. Glare is a big part of using the right LEDs, specifying the right product, designing around it. Glare is something that has become a byproduct of this new LED world. It is intrinsically a very intense light source because it's very small and emits a lot of light. That means it's going to be intense. So you have to be aware of that with LED and understand the difference between brightness and glare. Glare is where you've got that intensity. And we'll talk more about that in a couple other slides. But basically you have what's called disability glare and you have discomfort glare. There's no metric for glare. There's no number you can put on something that says this is how you measure glare. And a way to think of that is if I make a really, really annoying sound, some kind of horrible screeching noise right now, you would probably all agree, that was a horrible sound. But why? It wasn't just the volume, because you can hear things that are really loud that sound pretty good. It's not a certain wavelength. It's just, you just know, I don't like that sound. That's discomfort glare. You can be in an environment where there is glare and it's unpleasant. And then you've got disability glare where it's literally physiologically impeding you now from driving safely, or seeing other things, seeing people approaching you, you can't see them as well because your eyes, your rods and cones are being affected by the light source. That's disability glare. So glare is something that we have to deal with LED. We get all those advantages we talked about, but again, it is a very intense light source because it's a lot of brightness, it's a lot of light coming from a small point. Some other terms, and again, this is not a deep dive into any one of these, this is just touching on some things. If you've heard the term autonomous chip array, or you've ever seen an LED board like this, these are autonomous chips, and what you've got is individual LEDs, each one with its own optic. So instead of having, in the old days of HID, one lamp, and maybe one optic in the roof or one louvered system, every single light source has its own individual optic. So think of it like a symphony. When the symphony's warming up before the show, and there's that point where they all hit the same note, and it all kind of comes together, that's what this does. You have all these different optics pointing exactly where you want, and that's why you get improved uniformity, smoothness. You don't get the hot spots and rings, or you shouldn't if you're doing it the right way. But that's what autonomous chips are. OLED, or OLED, you may see this term or hear this term. Essentially, this is just organic LEDs. This is now the ability to emit light from like a smooth surface or a flexible surface. One of the neat applications to think about with OLEDs is, imagine if you were in your family room and you had a skylight. So during the day, that skylight's clear, you've got all this beautiful, wonderful sunshine filling the room. But then as the sun's going down, it's starting to get dark, that same panel, that same window begins to glow and emit light. So as it becomes dark and now it's nighttime, what used to be a window, a skylight, now looks like basically like a troffer. It is now lighting the room. That would be an example of how to use OLEDs. So organic LEDs have a lot of really cool applications. Again, not a deep dive today, but that's what that term is when you hear OLEDs. And then COB is something you're hearing more of. COB is simply chip on board. Instead of one diode on one substrate and all of the things that go into an LED, now you've got them all kind of packed into a small area. Might be the size of a dime or a quarter, but you've got all of these LED components basically into one spot. And one of the advantages of this is, instead of spreading out the light source over an area, which can make optical design challenging depending on the form of your luminaire, what kind of fixture you're looking at, you get back to kind of bringing the light source to one point, like you used to have with the arc tube of a lamp. But you have all those benefits though of LED versus that arc tube. The other big advantage with COB is generally cost savings, because now you've got less diodes, less optics, less circuit boards. So this is a nice way that companies are looking to bring costs down and make those LED products more affordable. L70 is a very important term. You'll see this on everybody's spec sheet. If no one's ever explained what L70 is, essentially it's what we call the useful life of an LED. It has nothing to do with the failure rate, and that's really important to understand. If you used to look at lamp life from metal halide, high pressure sodium, all those spec sheets and catalogs on lamps dealt with the failure rate. So metal halide, for example, a lot of them had a failure rate of, say, 15, or they have a lamp life of 15,000 hours. What that means is, in 15,000 hours, only half of them were still working. So if you installed 100 of them on your street, and you get to say 10,000 hours, some are failing. 11,000 more have failed. By the time you get to 15,000 hours, only half of those lamps are still working. High pressure sodium was a little longer. It was a longer failure rate. I think, I hardly remember anymore, it was 33%, or about 22,000 hours, I want to say, to a 33% failure rate. But again, these were failure rates. These were how long could you expect to wait until half or a third of the lamps even worked. When we talk about L70 and LEDs, this is how long it will take for the output from that diode to depreciate over time by 30%, where it is now emitting 70% of the original light. That's what L70 is. If you waited until it was only half as bright, that would be L50. It's 50% of the original brightness. The reason we picked 70% as the useful life is because we know from decades of research that our eyes don't pick up a difference in light level until it hits about 40%, unless it's, you're flipping the light on and off. But if you're sitting in a room and those lights are very, very slowly dimming, by the time somebody said, is it getting darker in here? They would have dimmed by almost 40% before we would pick it up. So to be safe, we picked 70 or 30% dim. So again, to be clear, if you're looking at someone's spec sheet and it says L70 of 100,000 hours, 50,000 hours, it's how long, assuming no failures, before you could possibly even begin to visually see a difference from the day those lights were energized. And today, 100,000 hours is kind of what you're seeing. When we first got into LED 10 years ago, 50,000 hours was a really good number. Today, if it's not at least 100,000, they're probably not doing very good engineering and thermal management to handle the heat. SPD, now here's a really technical term, spectral power distribution. This is not one that's going to come up over dinner unless you're specifically talking about this stuff. But what SPD simply is it's a measurement of the chromaticity or the spectral output of a light source. So for example, sunlight is this top one here. It's emitting light, and a lot of it, across the whole spectrum, purples, blues, greens, yellows, red. All of those colors are rendered very, very well out of sunlight. So the spectral power distribution is pretty high all the way along that spectrum of color. LED, you'll notice, has kind of a spike here toward the blue. There's a bit of a dip, and then it goes up again with reds, yellows, greens. That means the light coming out of a diode is going to be stronger in this area, weaker in this area, stronger in this area. Now the reason that LED has this hump here is because LEDs, even though they're high brightness, high output white, deep down are blue LEDs. And that's why if you look at an LED board and they all look yellow, what you're actually seeing is the phosphor coating on top of the diode. That phosphor is what makes that blue light come out white on the other side. But technically, they're blue LEDs, so you get the spike. Incandescent, you can see what theirs looks like. CFL. One of the examples that's not on here that's kind of interesting, though, is low pressure sodium. If anybody is in an environment around an observatory or somewhere where they insist on low pressure sodium, if you see the SPD of low pressure sodium, it's essentially a flat line with one really thin spike right there, and then it's flat again, because it only emits light in one very, very narrow band. And that's why observatories like it, because instead of trying to filter out all this different light from the city or the surrounding area so they can look at the stars, all they got to filter out is that tiny little one band, and they've essentially emitted all the light so they can observe at night. The problem is with that, you have virtually no color. So it's like you just stepped into Mayberry. Everything is black and white, everything is grayscale. I actually had a really cool experience one time in San Diego in that environment. I drove into the parking lot of a grocery store, and it was all lit with low pressure sodium. And I got on my car, and it's really wild. You're looking at yourself and like you're in black and white. It's like you went back into a 1950s TV show. It's just really a bizarre environment. But as I'm standing there, another car pulled in, and as their headlights went across these rows of parked cars, you saw these flashes of color. All the blues, reds, greens, everything came flying out because of their headlights. And then as soon as that car went by, everything was back in grayscale. It's kind of really bizarre. That's what SPD is, spectral power distribution. And it's going to change based on light sources. CRI, it's about 22 compared to sunlight. Sunlight CRI is 100. So you go outside in the middle of the day, your clothes, your skin, your car, your dog, everything looks exactly the way it's supposed to look. Plants, trees. Things at night under high pressure sodium with a CRI of about 22, everything looks washed out. It looks brownish, orange, yellow. You can't discern colors. LED, by and large, and metal halide and a couple of other light sources have a really good color rendering index. So you can see how this pops. The trees, the walkway, flowers, people wearing clothes. Police like this. So anywhere where security is a concern, LED is a great benefit, or a great advantage, because they can tell a blood stain from an oil stain. If something happens, people can say he was wearing a green jacket and he got in a blue car. Otherwise, good luck. in these kinds of environments. So from a safety standpoint, a good CRI is important. And for outdoor lighting, area applications, roadway, 70 is a great number. If you're going to go above 70 with CRI, you should be doing interior lighting in a restaurant, a museum, a hotel, something like that. But for outdoor applications like this, the CRI of 70 is fantastic. It's very safe. Now that said, CRI is kind of on the way out. It's not going to disappear overnight, but there is a new metric called, well, it's not called, but it was rolled out in IES TM30 in 2015. This is a different metric, and I'm not going to go into this today, but I wanted to mention it. The essential difference between these two is CRI is how accurately colors are rendered under different light sources. This has more to do with saturation. So you can take the same environment and you can show it to people very differently, because remember, what we're seeing is all a function of the light that hits our eyes and how our photoreceptors perceive it. So through TM30, this is a new way now to look at lighting and how we're going to perceive things. It's a little more complicated, but feel free to download that from the IES's website. Another term you're going to hear a lot about is CCT, correlated color temperature. Long name, very simple. It simply really is how cool or warm does that color temperature look. And at this point, usually I would have a little LED box and I'll show people a physical sample. This is a cool temperature, this is a warm temperature. But without that, you can see the range. So if you see LEDs somewhere like around the window of the 7-Eleven, they're usually like super ultra bluish white. That's a really cool bluish white color temperature. When you see LEDs, they're a little warmer, a little softer. They're going to be on the warmer end. A couple things to keep in mind. It's counterintuitive that the warmer you go, the lower the number is. People tend to think a cooler temperature is a lower number, like on a thermostat, but it's the opposite. Warmer temperatures on the lower end, 2,700, 3,000. Cooler temperatures on the bluer end, 5,000, 6,000 Kelvin. One other note on this. When these high brightness, high output white LEDs first started hitting the market about 10 years ago, they were around 62, 6,300. Those were some of the first outdoor pilot programs you saw. It was a very bluish white light, and it had to be to get a lot of lumens per watt to be efficient. Today, we're so far down the road with LEDs that you can get even more light today at warmer temperatures. So essentially, our market is kind of cycling today to this area here. About 3,000 to 45 is where you're seeing a lot of light sources for outdoor. So if someone's using something cooler than 45 and they're saying they have to do it, it's probably bad diodes, bad design. You shouldn't need that. Efficacy simply means lumens per watt. How much light per watt are you getting from those different light sources? And the thing to keep in mind with LED is you can see here, this is the increase in efficacy from these different light sources over the last several decades. It's been moderate at best, little improvements every now and then you've got LED, which is darn near going straight up. The efficacy and the amount of light per watt we've been able to get out of these diodes as the technology continues to improve is very, very impressive. And again, as you get to these higher efficacies, you're able to use warmer temperatures to get the light you need. And by and large, people like warmer temperatures. Nobody says I would much rather be walking around in 6,000 K environments than 4,000 K. So that's what efficacy is about. Now, standards, we'll talk about that for a couple of minutes. The IES, which you can see what it stands for there, used to be the lighting authority. Once we got into LED, all these other organizations started to pop up. Everybody started to weigh in on what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, how you should measure your standards, what kind of specifications you should write, what luminaires you should approve. It kind of became a wide open wild, wild west. I'm going to suggest to you that the IES remains the authority. And the reason for that is the IES does a lot of testing. They work in conjunction with the Department of Energy, national laboratories, Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, University of Michigan, the Rensselaer Institute. Northwest Pacific Labs. I mean, there's so many places they draw from. There is lots and lots of data, and there's a lot of debate and years spent looking at all this research to come up with the best standards. They're not legally binding, but you can bet if there's somebody on your mall property that was attacked in the parking lot and it goes to court, the defense is, or the prosecutor's going to ask you, what were your light levels in that parking lot at the time that attack happened, and what did the IES recommend you should have had? So they're not legally binding, but you want to be aware of them. And the IES produces documents like RPs, which are recommended practices, TMs, which are technical memorandums, DGs, design guides. So they really are the authority, and they should be. That's where people should be going for their information. With standards, there are other terms you're going to hear a lot. LM79. LM79 was a standard the IES produced that said this is how you should be testing the output of LEDs. When again, 10 years ago or so, when different companies started to produce diodes, they were measuring them differently and saying, mine lasts this long. It's going to take this long to get to L70 that we talked about earlier. This company said, mine's going to take this long to get to L70. Well, it turned out they were measuring them differently. So the IES created a standard that said, you're all going to test them this way. The room is going to be this temperature. You're going to have these elements in place. You're going to test it every 1,000 hours. And they tried to level the playing field. So all these other companies who were competing with one another had to give you data that you could actually accurately, safely compare. That's what LM79 is about. LM80, no, I take it back, I lied. Erase that.
Yeah.
What I just described was LM80, so switch here. That was LM80. LM80 was how you measured that, my bad. LM79 is something that, it's called absolute photometry. So what this pertains to, again, this is not a deep dive into any of these. What this means is, if I take an IES file of a fixture that I tested with a 150 watt HPS lamp, and I generate an IES file. If I run my layout and I need more light, I can go into that file and I can change it, that same file, to approximate what a 250 watt HPS lamp would have done. I can rerun my layout. Or I can reduce it and say, well, that's too much light. I only really need maybe a 100 watt HPS lamp. So I can go in there and I can play with these different elements using the same IES file. You can't do that with LED. If you are looking at an IES file for a fixture that was tested in 38 watts with this color temperature and this drive current, and you get that IES file, and it's either more or less than what you need, you can't just go in there and manipulate it and say, well, I know that that company also has, instead of this 80 diode version, I know they have a 60 diode version, so I'm just going to go in and I'm going to reduce everything by 30% and run it again. Because if I build that same fixture with less diodes, less circuit boards, the thermal signature is different. All the thermals change, and LED is very, very reliant on the thermal environment. So you can't extrapolate, you can't guess. This means if you want to know what the 60 LED version did, you need to get the IES file for the 60 LED version of that fixture. You don't go in there and extrapolate, you don't play with those numbers. The only thing you can do per LM79 is you can change the color temperature. So if someone gives you an IES file that was based on a fixture that was built and tested at 4,000K, and you want to know what that would have done at 3,000K, you can get the proper multiplier from that manufacturer, and you can change that aspect in the file and use the same file. That's the only element you can change per LM79. Anything else, if someone's giving you files and asking you to use their fixture, but they're giving you files that are not the specific fixture you're looking for, don't trust them. And don't trust that manufacturer, because it's not going to show you what you're really going to get. So again, I'm going to skip over a little bit of this for time. TM21 is basically the newer, more improved version of LM80. LM80 had testing that went out to 6,000 hours. But one of the things that diode manufacturers found is funny things started to happen even after 6,000 hours. So TM21 goes further with the testing, and it also lets you now extrapolate life. So again, in brief, let's say per LM80, you're getting data points on your depreciation every 1,000 hours for 6,000 hours. So here's L70 down here. Well, I've tested it for 6,000 hours and I'm still way up here. So what this will allow you to do is extrapolate based on at least 6 data points, how long would it have taken for you to actually hit that L70? So you're allowed to give a projected value. There's other things to TM21, but essentially this is what picked up where LM80 left off. It's a newer, more accurate version for extended lumen testing. Again, not a deep dive today into any one of these. We could go into all of that another time. Bug ratings, very important. You're all probably familiar with cutoff, full cutoff, semi-cutoff. Those were, they were never a formal luminaire classification system, but they kind of morphed into that in a lot of people's minds. All they talked about, or all they really referenced essentially, was how much light was coming out of a fixture at or above 90 degrees. And that would give you your definition of whether it was full cutoff, semi-cutoff, cutoff. There were another aspect to it, but by and large, that's all people were really measuring. What's coming out at or above 90 degrees? Well, the problem with cutoff is if you have fixtures that are sending out the light like this, they're not anywhere near 90 degrees, they're sending the light out like this, you're probably bouncing a lot of that light right back into the sky. And that was the whole point, was to protect the night sky. So if you've ever made a bank shot on a pool table, you know angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. So you can't just shoot light out like this without bouncing a lot of it back. So we needed a better metric. Bug was developed back in 2011, and now we have 10 different zones all around the fixture. You've got a much broader area now that we're measuring. It also separated the back from the front, which cutoff never did. It's obviously very important if you look at what light is going in the target area versus what light is going behind the light. So you've got all these different zones. The upward area above 90 is split into 2 areas, 90 to 100, and then 100 to 180. So people say, well, it's bug. So what does that stand for? Bug is backlight, uplight, and glare. Backlight is going to be these 4 zones right there. Uplight, again, is going to be upward low and upward high on both sides. And then here's your front. So where's glare? Glare is actually, let me back up. Glare is measured from 90 to 60 on both sides, 60 to 90 degrees. These 4 zones, front very high, front high, back very high, back high, those lumens are considered glare. Now, little sidebar here. Again, we could spend an hour just on bug. This is a much better mousetrap than cutoff was, but that is a huge problem. You can't just define everything coming out from 60 to 90 as glare. Because first off, glare has no metric. You can't measure glare. There is no number. There's no way to accurately measure glare. It's an intensity value. And again, there's different kinds of glare. There's discomfort glare, there's disability glare. But the main point is, you generally want your main beam out of a luminaire coming out at about 67, 72 degrees. That's going to give you good coverage, good spacing, good uniformity. This is kind of your sweet spot, you know, right in there. This is where you want the light coming out. You don't have the high angle beams that are going to cause glare. You want it to go out. If you push everything down to 60 degrees or below, number one, you're going to bounce a lot of that light back into the sky. You're going to have bad spacing, you're going to have bad uniformity, and you're going to have a dark cavernous area because you're not letting that light go out. It's also not very safe because you want something called vertical foot candles. You want some foot candles going out horizontally so you can see someone's face approaching you on the street. Do you recognize that person, or are they a stranger? Do they look angry? Are they mumbling to themselves? So you need to have light going out at a broad angle. You don't want it going out and up, but you want it going out. So again, could spend a lot of time just on bug, but you want to know what that is. Backlight, uplight, glare. Essentially, it's a measurement of the light you don't want. It's everything except the lumens going forward into your targeted area. This is like all the residue that's not going where you're trying to point the light. But again, it has flaws, so take it with a grain of salt. RP8, again, recommended practices. RP8, very important document. There's a lot of different sections that will tell you how much light you should have on your road. Is it a main collector? Is it a main arterial? RP8 is going to cover all sorts of different outdoor applications. important document. Again, you could spend an hour just on that, but understand that RP8, again, is going to have lots of tables based on your application and give you an idea of how much light you probably need. It's a good place to start. Another important standard has to do with controls. We talked about controls earlier, how everything is going this way. There is a standard you want to be aware of, ANSI C136.41, etc. This has to do with control receptacles. It has to do with controls that are operated by a twist lock receptacle. When this technology started to get developed, there was a race among several companies trying to become the standard for how you would integrate wireless controls in a twist lock style of application, because some companies have proprietary designs. In the end, ANSI chose what they thought was the best level playing field for everybody, and now you have a 5-pin receptacle and a 7-pin. It's the same footprint as the old 3-pin receptacle you would use for a twist lock photocell, same size. So if you had a fixture that had room for a 3-pin photocell receptacle, it's going to have room for one of these, same footprint. This is the original 3. These two here, which is what makes that a 5-pin, are going to give you the ability to do dimming. So that's something you can now integrate. If you want to integrate motion sensors, which we're going to talk about a little bit more a couple slides down the road, then you need two more contacts. So you have a 7-pin. Now, by and large, what you'll find is a lot of people are kind of almost obsoleted the 5 immediately and just went to the 7. It basically said if you're going to use a twist lock control receptacle, you may as well go to a 7 and future-proof it, which we'll talk about later. But you can do a 5 or a 7. Again, same footprint as the old 3-pin. One of the reasons you may want those last two contacts to do motion sensing is because a lot of ordinances and lighting guidelines are being derived from California Title 24. Generally, as goes California, goes the country. So California's Energy Code Title 24 mandates adaptive lighting. So one part of it is going to say that if you've got outdoor lighting, this is not roadway lighting, but we're talking about parks, pathways, things like that. If you've got lighting that's mounted up to 24 feet, it's below 24 feet, you've got to have it on a timer, because you don't need full power all night long. You've got to have it able to dim by at least 40%. In fact, it might even be 50, I think, today. And it has to have a motion sensor. So essentially what this means is you're going to have your light come on at a certain level, and then later on in the evening, it's got to dim down because traffic has reduced, pedestrian traffic, vehicular traffic, and at that point, if somebody goes by, a jogger, a car, whatever it is, it hits that motion sensor, it'll go back up. And then when they're gone, it goes back down. So you have to have adaptive lighting, and more states and cities are adopting the same kind of verbiage. So that's where that 6th and 7th contact would come in if you want to integrate a motion sensor on top of the dimming capability. There are some other entities here. I mentioned earlier a lot of people are wanting to tell you what to do with lighting. I still maintain that the IES is the one you want to focus on, but the DOE is a good place to go. That's pretty good. Well, it used to be a good department. I don't know how it is today. But the DOE is a good place to go for information. They also have a kind of a subsidiary called the MSSLC, the Municipal Solid and State Street Lighting Consortium. This started out as a group of cities that wanted to share information so they could learn from each other. What did you try? What did you try? What worked? What didn't work? So that has kind of morphed into the MSSLC. But again, the downside is they have their own list of this is what you should be looking at, here's how you should measure things, this is how you should write a spec. So take it with a grain of salt, but there's some good information here. The CLTC is a pretty good independent source of testing and data if you want to, again, bone up on LED and where it's going, what's coming. Rensselaer out in California is another outstanding entity. Now, these last two, I'm just going to give you a fair warning. I would take these with a grain of salt. The Design Lights Consortium is a group of utilities that started out in the Northeast a while ago, and it was a great idea. What they did is when LEDs started to come on about 10 years ago, there were a lot of utilities around the country that said, hey, you know what, I guess we got to look at this. Our mayors are starting to hear about it. But they didn't have the capability to do all the testing, they didn't have the facilities, they didn't have the knowledge to compare and rate fixtures, and this was utilities all across the country. So a group of about 14 of them got together and they said, you know what, we got this, we've got the expertise, we've got the facilities, we're gonna go ahead and test this stuff, we're gonna put it through its paces, and we're gonna share that information with all of our utility brothers and cousins, and it was a great idea, and it worked pretty well. So they would establish minimum efficacies that they would recommend utilities adopt. So in other words, if this particular luminaire that we tested didn't have at least this much light per watt, it's probably not very efficient. These over here we tested, they were very efficient. So it was a great idea. The problem is, that was 10 years ago. To maintain their relevance, the DLC just keeps ramping up their minimum efficacies higher and higher and higher and higher. And the problem is, they are now recommending levels of efficacy that can only be achieved through what I would call bad lighting design. It's either very, very cool color temperatures, up to 5700K, they will approve, up to 5700K to hit these efficacies that they're suggesting you should target. Or it's pushing you to things like clear lenses that promote glare. Because one of the things that we talked about earlier was glare, and one way to address glare are diffuse lenses, which you're starting to see more and more manufacturers adopt. You don't have to have a completely clear lens, whether it's glass or acrylic, to get the light you need. Because that is such an intense light source, you can have a more diffuse lens under the LEDs as long as it doesn't severely mitigate your directional control. The DLC is only concerned with efficacy, period. Nothing else, not glare, not uniformity, not night sky, not anything. It is strictly how much light per watt. So, in my mind, they've gone from useful and helpful to now being a danger. The Dark Sky Association, this is a group that the first thing they're going to ask you when you talk about lighting is, well, why do you need a light there at all? They are a group that feels like artificial lighting is not necessary 90% of the time. They will actively try to convince you that there is no proof whatsoever that adding lighting to an environment makes it safer, which I think is patently silly. So that's all I'm going to say about these two. Be careful. The rest of these are pretty good sources for information, but again, the IES is probably the best place to go. Future proofing, something to always think about. Even when you think you've got enough space, it tends to go pretty quickly. Or when you think you're thinking ahead, sometimes you realize you didn't think far enough ahead. So dimming drivers, this is something that has become fairly standard in the industry now. Early on, dimming drivers were an option. Today, pretty much everything is going to be dimmable, because even if you're not dimming today, you probably are going to in the future. So if you're looking at a fixture, make sure you specify a dimming driver. You've got that safety net even if you're not dimming today. Again, we talked about the receptacle, whether it's the 5-pin or the 7-pin. If you've got a dimming driver, or what's even more common today that's starting to become common is programmable drivers, either one of those, and you've got a receptacle like this, you're probably okay if you do decide to adopt controls or dimming or adaptive lighting down the road. But you want to make sure you've got those in place. From a best practices standpoint, some terms, again, you may hear, not diving deep into any of these. RoHS, if you ever see this and you wonder what that is, RoHS is the Restriction on Hazardous Substances. It started in Europe. And essentially, this has to do with certifying that whatever you're looking at has no lead, no heavy metals, no mercury. It's environmentally friendly. So a lot of fixtures that are RoHS compliant are made of material that's 100% recyclable. Some of it may already have been recycled. NAVLAP, I forget what this stands for. NAVLAP is, what does that stand for?
Voluntary.
National Voluntary
Laboratory Accreditation Process? Program. Essentially what this means is those IES files we talked about that are telling you what that luminaire is going to do, how long it's going to take to depreciate to L70, all of that stuff, if it wasn't generated, if those IES files were not generated in a NAVLAP certified facility, don't trust them. Because again, there's a lot of games out there. It goes back to that caveat emptor. Whoever generated those IES files should be doing it per LM79, and it should be in an accredited testing facility. ANSI, American National Standards Institute. ANSI is a great source, again, for standards, as the name implies. That's what they're there for, is to try to keep things above board. This last one, caliper, is an offshoot of the Department of Energy. This is commercially available caliper. So I'll have to look that one up. I can't remember. Anybody remember what caliper is? Commercially available lighting. IPR. So IPR is the last part. So what caliper does is, and this is your tax dollar, so you want to take advantage of this. What this group does is they go out and they anonymously buy lighting products off the shelf, and they take them back to the back cave and they run them through all sorts of tests, and then they publish it. They don't call the manufacturer and say, we want you to send us some samples that we can test. They don't want cherry-picked things. They just go off, they anonymously buy these things on the market, and they put them through their paces, and they'll tell you, we tested this product, it said it was producing 107 lumens per watt, we found that it was really 88. They said it was 3000 K, it was really 3800 K. Or they said it was a type 3, it really was more of a type 2. Or if it does pretty much exactly what it says it does, they're going to tell you that too. So caliper is out there to randomly test products and let you know who is really being above board and honest with their marketing and who is maybe not so much. Now, if you go to their reports, to their website, you'll have to look and see what they tested that round. Sometimes it may be an LED desk lamp, it could be an under cabinet light, it might be a street light. So you can look at whatever report you want, and you can see the kind of lighting that you're interested in. And there's two kind of reports. One of them is more general, it's going to give you that information, but it's not going to call out the manufacturer. It's just going to say we tested a desk lamp, it may have a photo of it. The other report is more detailed and it will give you the specific product. The reason for that is because if they say we tested something and we found out all this information was bogus, and then that manufacturer wants to come back and dispute it, then they've got the other report to say, no, this is exactly what we tested, here's the complete catalog number, this is the exact item. So there's two different reports there, but it's online and it's a good point of information. Another term you may hear more and more is IP. IP is ingress protection. This is a measurement basically of how well that luminaire is sealed. Because one of the things you'll hear people talk about is that LED is virtually maintenance free. Not that anything is maintenance free, but truly if you have a well-engineered, well-designed, well-built LED luminaire, you really shouldn't have to touch it for about 15 years till it's time to maybe change the driver. It really should stand on its own with virtually no maintenance. But that assumes some things. It needs to be IP sealed. That means water's not getting in, particulates aren't getting in. So ingress protection first measures water intrusion. Particulate intrusion. So if you have a 6 rating, this is dust tight. So forget bugs, bees, gnats, any winged creatures. If you have an IP rating of 6, it's dust tight. Nothing is going to get in there. You're not going to have dirt coming into your lens chamber and depreciating the light output. The second number has to do with water intrusion. So once you get past about IP66, really past that, these are submersible lights. You're talking about lights in a swimming pool or a fountain. Anything that's rated IP65, 66, that's pretty well sealed. You're talking about high-powered jets of water from all different angles. There's no storm that's going to get water in there, even if it's raining sideways. If it's IP65, 66, you're in good shape. But that's what IP is, ingress protection. If the fixture you're looking at is not well rated with IP, then don't think it's going to stand out there by itself for 15 years. It's going to end up getting dirt and possibly water inside. If you get water inside, remember this is an electronic component. Anything could fail. Now, as far as what's coming up, some of these terms you'll start to hear about or may have already heard about. V2V, that's vehicle to vehicle, and you've probably all seen the commercials of what happens if I'm driving down the street and my car knows before I do that there was an accident 5 cars ahead. Your car is going to know what's going on before you do. V2V is cars talking to each other. They're basically moving computer networks, and they're constantly, many times a second, emitting and sharing information with each other as far as direction, weight, speed, road conditions, friction, all that sort of thing. So these vehicles are talking to each other. This is going to become more and more common. where it's an option on some cars. Today, someday it's probably going to be like seat belts. They're all going to have it. So V2V is vehicle to vehicle. That's kind of the first stage in a large IoT kind of a thing. V2I is going to follow that. That's a vehicle to infrastructure. This is already happening. This is cars talking to streetlights and traffic signals. Usually intersections is where most accidents happen. So you're going to have vehicles, especially at the intersections, communicating with the streetlights. I saw a video a year ago from Virginia Tech Transportation Institute of their smart road that had Cobra Head roadway poles, 25, 30-foot poles spaced down the road at night, and they were all at a kind of a low level of light output. And here comes the car, you see the headlights coming. As that car goes by, those lights come up. As the car goes by, the lights go back down. It wasn't a motion sensor. That car was talking to those lights. So it'll do the same thing at intersections in different directions, even if it's not going in that direction. So V2I is next, and all of that, of course, is part of what we would call the smart grid or the Internet of Things. All of that is what's coming. Now, this was a little talk on what I mentioned earlier with Bug about that problem with glare. So I think that's about it. It's on the horizon. There you go.